Chapter 1. The Desert of Hope. The planet of Zaltari had once been a bustling hub of culture and knowledge, a world renowned across the galaxy for its architecture, its technological marvels, and its rich history. But now, it was a graveyard silent and still, save for the occasional gust of wind that carried the scent of rusted metal and forgotten dreams. The surface was an expanse of sand, red and golden in the harsh light of two suns that beat down relentlessly upon the barren terrain. There was no sign of life here, no sound of the once vibrant markets or the songs that had filled the streets of its now destroyed cities. In the distance, skeletal remains of buildings and collapsed structures jutted out from the ground like the ribs of a long-dead beast, reminders of a civilization that had fallen to its own ambitions. In the midst of this unforgiving wasteland, a lone figure lay crumpled against the ruins of a collapsed tower, her breathing shallow and ragged. Lyra, an alien girl with skin the color of twilight and eyes as violet as the dying light of the twin suns, fought to remain conscious. Her body was a patchwork of injuries, the aftermath of an assault that had left her battered and broken. She had been abandoned, left to die in the desert, far from the rest of her people, her family, her friends. Her once beautiful silver-blue skin was now mottled with bruises, and her hair, which had shimmered like the moonlight on the shores of her homeland, now lay tangled and matted in the dirt. The pain was unbearable. Every breath felt like 1,000 needles piercing her chest, and the broken remnants of her body cried out for relief. Her left leg was twisted unnaturally beneath her, the bone shattered beyond recognition, and her abdomen was oozing blood from a deep gash that ran from her ribs down to her waist. Her right arm was little more than a mangled mass of flesh and bone, crushed beyond hope of healing. She had no hope left. The battle that had brought her here had been swift and brutal, a war between factions that had once called Zaltari home. But the war, like so many others, had been fueled by greed, ambition, and misunderstanding. Her people had fought to protect their culture, to preserve the traditions of their ancestors, but they had been outnumbered, outgunned, and overwhelmed by the superior military might of their enemies. They had fought valiantly, but the battle had been lost before it had even begun. Lyra had been captured in the final days of the war, taken by the very soldiers she had once called comrades, left behind in the aftermath of the war's carnage, abandoned as a casualty of a lost cause. Now, as the sun set low on the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the wreckage of her world, Lyra knew that death was not far off. Her strength was fading with each passing moment, her body too injured, too broken to hold on for much longer. The hot winds swept across the barren landscape, picking up the dust and grit of the dead planet, swirling it around her in a final mockery of life. She had no water, no food, no hope of survival. The war had stolen everything from her: her home, her family, her future, and now it was stealing her life, too. Her thoughts drifted in and out of focus, memories of her childhood flashing in front of her like the fading images on an old, broken hollow recording. She remembered the laughter of her family, the warmth of her mother's touch, the wisdom of her father's voice. She remembered the songs of her people, the melodies that had been passed down through generations, each note carrying with it the weight of their history, their struggles, their dreams. But all of that was gone now, lost to the fires of war and the cruelty of her enemies. She could feel herself slipping away, her consciousness fading, the darkness pulling at her like a blanket. Her last thoughts were not of fear, but of regret. Regret that she had never been able to see the stars again, never been able to share the stories of her people with the next generation. Regret that she had not been able to fight harder, longer, to save her world. She closed her eyes for the final time, ready to surrender herself to the inevitable, knowing that there would be no one left to remember her. But then, something shifted. A sound, faint at first, but growing louder. The rumble of an engine, a low hum that vibrated through the air, barely audible over the howling winds. Lyra's eyes flickered open, the haze of pain and exhaustion clouding her vision. But the sound was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was coming. She had no strength left to move, but her heart quickened with a sudden surge of hope she had thought lost forever. Could it be a rescue? Was there someone out there who still cared? Someone who could see her and bring her the salvation she had long given up on? The sound grew louder, closer, until she could feel the vibrations in her bones. The ship, whatever it was drawing near. Lyra tried to focus her eyes, to make sense of the blurry image in front of her, but the pain and the darkness clouded her mind. She reached out with her remaining strength, her fingers twitching, hoping to signal her presence, but there was nothing. She couldn't even lift her hand. Her vision darkened again, and the sound seemed to fade as the final wave of unconsciousness took over. Chapter 2. The Soldier. The ship that approached Lyra's position was small, unassuming, but it was sleek and agile, its engines humming with the power of a well-maintained craft. It was a military transport, nothing like the gargantuan warships of the faction that had ravaged Zaltari, but it was still a force to be reckoned with. Its hull was painted in matte black, designed to blend into the shadows of space and avoid detection by the advanced sensors of enemy ships. The craft glided effortlessly over the desert landscape, its pilot expertly navigating the treacherous terrain, searching for any signs of life, any survivors in need of help. Sergeant Ethan Carter sat in the cockpit, his fingers dancing across the controls as he guided the ship down toward the coordinates he had received from the planetary distress beacon. He was a soldier, but not of any faction. He wasn't here to fight for the Empire or any government. His mission was to find the forgotten ones, the abandoned, the wounded, and to offer them a chance at survival. The galaxy was filled with chaos and conflict, but there were always those who had been left behind, those who had been forgotten in the wake of war. That was where Ethan came in. He had been a soldier once, a part of a vast army that had fought to maintain the peace. But after the wars had ended, after the great empires had collapsed, Ethan had found his true calling. He had become a scavenger, a protector of the lost. He flew through the galaxy, looking for those who needed help, those who had no one else to turn to. And today, his search had brought him to Zaltari, to this dying planet where the war had taken everything from its people. As the transport ship descended toward the wreckage of the planet's last city, Ethan's heart clenched in anticipation. He had seen death before too much of it, but it never got easier. Every time he set foot on a battlefield, every time he saw the devastation wrought by war, he was reminded of the price that had been paid. His eyes scanned the terrain below, and that was when he saw her, a small figure lying motionless against the ruins of a collapsed tower, her body broken and her condition grave. Ethan immediately set the ship down, the transport gliding softly to a halt in the sand. He wasted no time, running from the cockpit and down the ramp, his boots crunching against the sand as he approached the wounded alien girl. She was barely breathing, her skin a strange shade of violet that contrasted sharply with the dust and blood that covered her body. Her eyes were closed, her chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. Ethan knelt beside her, his hands trembling as he gently checked for a pulse. It was weak, but steady. She was alive barely. But not for long, not unless he got her medical attention. Without hesitation, he scooped her up in his arms, his strong hands cradling her fragile form. Her head rested against his shoulder, and for a moment, he could feel the weight of her pain, the weight of her suffering. It wasn't just physical, it was something deeper, something that only came from a lifetime of loss, of abandonment, of being forgotten by the universe. She had no hope left, but Ethan wasn't about to let her die here, in this barren wasteland. "Hang on," he whispered, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. "I've got you. You're not alone anymore." With the alien girl in his arms, Ethan made his way back to the ship. The transport's engines roared to life as he quickly lifted off, the winds of the desert planet kicking up behind them as they shot off into the sky. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a flicker of hope. He had found someone. And for whatever reason, this girl, this broken soul had been left behind, cast aside, just like so many others. But she wasn't abandoned anymore. He wasn't going to let her go through this alone. She had a future, a chance at survival, and he would fight for it. The heat of the two suns above was oppressive, pushing even the hardest of survivors to the edge of their limits. The winds that whipped through the empty plains carried the dust of centuries, covering everything in a thick, suffocating layer of grit. There was no sign of any living creatures in the vast expanse of sand and ruin. The once thriving alien world of Zaltari had been brought to its knees in the wake of war, its people scattered or erased entirely by forces too powerful to be resisted. Now, it was just another desolate world, a testament to the destruction that came with greed, power, and endless conflict. Lyra's mind barely grasped at the reality around her. Every thought was a blurry mess of images and fragmented memories that slipped away just as quickly as they formed. She could remember the sounds of the war, the screams of her people as they fought valiantly to protect their homes, their families, only to be crushed under the might of the enemy. Her people, her family, had been lost in the chaos. She had been captured, taken prisoner, and then left to die in this forsaken place. Her body, broken and bruised, felt as if it was made of stone. Each shallow breath sent waves of pain through her chest, but the pain was a distant thing now, something she had grown used to. The blackness behind her eyes was calling to her. It would be so easy to just let go, to surrender to the peace that awaited her. But a flicker of something deep within refused to let go. She had no strength to fight, no energy to escape, but a part of her, some small, flickering part, refused to give in. The sound of a ship's engines reached her ears, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing moment. The noise was unfamiliar, different from the drones or combat ships that had filled the air in the days following her capture. She tried to focus, her mind struggling to latch onto this small sign of life, but everything around her felt far away. Her fingers twitched, the only part of her that still responded to the world outside. A hand, bloodied and trembling, reached out, not to grasp anything but to signal, to hope that someone, anyone, would see her and come to her aid. The world around her began to swim in and out of focus as she fell in and out of consciousness, her body trying to protect itself from the pain. The ship's engines roared louder now, a heavy thrum that vibrated through the air and the ground beneath her. She wanted to scream, to call out, but her throat was dry, her voice a distant, forgotten thing. In the distance, she saw the outline of the ship, a sleek, agile craft, gliding toward her with a precision that suggested purpose. For a fleeting moment, she wondered if it was a dream. Her mind had become too fractured to discern what was real anymore. But the ship descended quickly, a lifeline in the storm of her final moments. A human soldier, if the uniform was any indication, appeared on the ship's ramp as it touched down, a figure that seemed to materialize from the dust and heat. His eyes scanned the wasteland, searching for the source of the faint distress signal. And then, he saw her, Lyra. His eyes widened for a moment, not out of fear but concern, before he rushed to her side. Chapter 2. The Soldier's Resolve. Ethan Carter had seen his fair share of battlefields, and he had seen his share of wreckage and ruin, but nothing had prepared him for what lay before him on this forgotten world. He had come here on the tail end of a distress signal, an unexpected call that he had almost passed over, but something about it had drawn him in. A voice, broken, barely audible, had reached him, and it had triggered something in him. So he had followed the call, guiding his small transport ship through the empty expanse of Zaltari, not knowing what he would find. Now, standing over the broken alien girl before him, Ethan's heart clenched. Her violet eyes were barely open, and her pale blue skin was smeared with blood and dirt. She was barely breathing, and yet, there was something about her that made him pause. He had saved many people in his career, but never like this. Never someone who seemed so completely abandoned by the universe, so forgotten. The situation was dire. The girl had no visible wounds on her face, but her body was a map of suffering bruises, burns, and cuts from the battle that had brought her here. The smell of blood was strong in the air, and the way she trembled in his arms told him that she had been left in this state for far too long. But there was no time to dwell on that. There was only the urgency of the moment. He needed to get her back to his ship, get her medical attention, and pray that it wasn't too late. He had no idea who she was, where she came from, or why she had been left to die in this place. But he could see the remnants of a life within her, an indomitable will, despite everything that had been taken from her. Ethan moved quickly, scooping her up into his arms as gently as he could, his military instincts kicking in. His training told him to remain calm, to focus on the mission, but even as his mind worked through the logistics, there was a part of him that couldn't ignore the sheer vulnerability of the girl in his arms. He had never been one to shy away from danger, but there was something different about this situation, something that tugged at him in a way he didn't quite understand. He had seen soldiers fall in battle, watched planets burn, but this was different. This girl wasn't a casualty of war, she was a victim, abandoned to die. He turned quickly, making his way back to the transport ship, his steps urgent but measured. Behind him, the desert stretched endlessly, the dying planet's vast emptiness echoing with the silence of forgotten wars. Ethan didn't waste any more time thinking about the why or how of her presence here. There was no need. She was alive for now, and that was enough. He had to focus on what mattered, getting her to safety. Once inside the transport ship, Ethan carefully laid the alien girl down on the medbay table. The small ship's medical equipment, though limited, was enough to stabilize her for the time being. He activated the emergency systems, the sterile white lights of the med bay flickering to life as diagnostic scans began running. His fingers moved quickly, activating the ship's automated healing tools as the girl's vitals were displayed on the screen in front of him. Her heart rate was dangerously slow, and her blood pressure was so low that the machines barely registered it. She was fading fast, but Ethan wasn't about to give up on her. "Come on, stay with me," he muttered under his breath, his voice firm but gentle. The machines beeped as they injected a stabilizer into her bloodstream, and slowly, the girl's breathing began to steady. But she wasn't out of the woods yet. The injuries she had sustained were severe. There were fractures and internal bleeding, damage to vital organs. Her body had been through hell. Ethan moved to the side, collecting the last of the medical supplies from the emergency kit. His mind worked quickly, the years of soldiering guiding his hands as he operated on autopilot. He knew he couldn't save everyone, but he wasn't going to let this girl be another casualty he couldn't do anything for. Not on his watch. As his hands moved over the injured alien girl's body, repairing the damage as best he couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility. Who was she? Why had she been left to die? And what happened to the people who had abandoned her? Ethan's mind was a whirl of questions, but he didn't have the answers, not yet. All he could do was focus on the girl lying in front of him. Her life, fragile and fading, was in his hands now, and he would do everything in his power to bring her back from the brink. The ship hummed as it flew through the star-streaked void of space. Ethan had no destination in mind, not yet. But for now, the only thing that mattered was that she had been found, and he wouldn't let her go. Ethan Carter worked through the night, using every medical tool at his disposal to stabilize the alien girl. He'd fought in countless battles, encountered enemy forces of every kind, and had been thrust into dangerous situations without hesitation. But this was different. This wasn't a fight against an enemy. This was a fight for life itself. The ship hummed with a steady rhythm as the medbay's sterile lighting bathed the alien girl in an eerie glow. She was lying motionless on the examination table, her breathing still shallow but slightly steadier than before. Her injuries were far too extensive for a simple treatment. Her body was a labyrinth of fractures, lacerations, and internal bleeding. Ethan's training told him that her survival would require more than just patching up the obvious wounds. He had to address the deeper, more systemic damage that threatened to shut down her body's functions. Ethan was a soldier, trained for warfare and survival, but even his vast experience in combat didn't prepare him for the strange feeling of responsibility he now carried. He had seen soldiers die, he had seen planets burn, but this was different. This was a girl, a stranger, and yet, as he worked over her unconscious form, there was a growing sense within him, something that told him she was important, that her life meant something more than just a casualty in a war. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his movements quick and precise as he applied the final touch of a regenerative gel to her damaged leg. The wound was slowly starting to close, but he knew it would take time. He'd done everything he could for now, and it was a delicate balance between giving her enough time to heal and not pushing her body past its breaking point. The ship's automed system gave a soft beep, signaling that it had done its best to stabilize the girl's vital signs. Ethan stood back for a moment, running a hand through his dark hair as he let out a deep sigh. "You're not alone anymore," he muttered softly, though he wasn't sure whether he was speaking to her or to himself. His mind, always alert and sharp during the chaos of battle, now struggled to find a sense of peace in this quiet, sterile environment. It was clear that the girl had been abandoned, left to die on this ruined planet with no regard for her life. But who had done this to her? Why had she been left to rot in the desert, a casualty of a war she hadn't even chosen to fight? He couldn't ignore it. The girl's injuries weren't just physical. There was a story behind them, a story of betrayal, of abandonment. Ethan had seen enough war to know that it didn't just destroy the body, it destroyed everything. It left scars that couldn't always be seen, scars that were etched deep into the soul. And this girl, with her haunting violet eyes, her pale skin, and the strange markings that adorned her face, was no exception. She had been part of something far bigger, something far more dangerous than anything Ethan had ever dealt with. And yet, here she was, lying in front of him, a stranger he had just met, but who was now inexplicably tied to his fate. A soft groan escaped her lips, and Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He turned back quickly, his hands poised over her, as if ready to jump into action. Her violet eyes fluttered open, the irises shimmering in the soft light, and she blinked several times as though struggling to regain her bearings. It was a moment of slow realization, the girl trying to comprehend her surroundings, trying to understand what was happening. And then her gaze met his. She looked confused at first, and then something else flashed in her eyes: fear, recognition, desperation. Ethan remained calm, not wanting to startle her. He could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken weight of everything that had happened to her. She had been through so much, and now, here she was alive. But what had it cost her? And what would it cost him? "Hey, easy there," he said softly, his voice steady but gentle. "You're safe now. You're on my ship. We're out of danger." She blinked again, her voice weak, like a whisper carried by the wind. Who are you?" Ethan smiled slightly, though it was a weary smile. "I'm Sergeant Ethan Carter," he said, trying to reassure her with his calm presence. "I'm a soldier, but right now, I'm just a guy trying to make sure you get out of here alive." The girl's breath hitched, and for a moment, there was a flash of recognition in her eyes, followed by an immediate flinch. It was clear that something about the situation was overwhelming her, and Ethan could sense that there was more to her than just a simple wounded survivor. She wasn't just any alien. There was a depth to her, something mysterious and unknown, something that she wasn't ready to share yet. She tried to sit up, her movements slow and pained, but Ethan placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, urging her to stay down. No, you need to rest. You're still healing." Her eyes darted to his hand before slowly meeting his gaze again. "Who are you really? Why did you save me?" Her voice was hoarse, her words strained, but they carried an unmistakable weight. "I'm nothing but a casualty. Why would you bother?" Ethan's expression softened as he leaned back slightly, taking a moment before answering. "Maybe because I've seen too many people die, too many people who were forgotten by the rest of the galaxy. I've made a career of saving people who never got a second chance." He paused, unsure whether his words would reach her, but he needed her to understand. "You're not a casualty. You matter." Her gaze softened, but she said nothing, and for a few moments, they just looked at each other, an unspoken understanding beginning to form between them. Ethan could see the pain in her eyes, the deep-set sorrow that came with survival after so much destruction. She was more than a victim of war. She was someone who had seen the very worst of the galaxy and was still struggling to find her place in it. "My name, it's Lyra," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I don't know why you're here or why you're helping me, but thank you." She winced, trying to sit up again, and this time Ethan allowed her, watching closely as she gathered her strength. Lyra's eyes searched his face, and it was clear she was calculating, evaluating him with a keen, sharp look. "But what will you do with me now?" Her voice was quieter now, almost resigned. "What happens to me after all this?" Ethan took a deep breath, then offered a reassuring smile. "You don't have to worry about that. We'll get you to safety. We'll figure out what's next. But for now, you focus on getting better. We take it one step at a time." Chapter 3, Unveiling the Past. Lyra's recovery was slow, but with each passing day, she regained more strength, the damage from her wounds slowly healing under the care of Ethan's makeshift medbay. As the days passed, her physical injuries healed, but the emotional scars, the trauma she carried with her remained etched deep within her. She was a survivor, no question, but what did that make her now? In the quiet moments, when Ethan wasn't around, she often wondered if she was even worthy of survival, if the cost of living on after the destruction of her world, her family, was too great a burden to bear. Ethan didn't push her to talk about what had happened. He was a soldier, not a therapist, and he understood that some wounds couldn't be healed by words alone. Instead, he kept the ship moving, charting a course through the quieter regions of space, away from the conflict and bloodshed, hoping to find a place where Lyra could rest. They were safe for now, but Ethan knew that once the truth of who Lyra was began to emerge, their peace would be short-lived. He couldn't ignore it. The Titan, the sleek ship Lyra had been left to die on, wasn't just a random casualty of war. It had a purpose. It had been part of something bigger, something more dangerous. And Lyra? She wasn't just a survivor. She was a key player in a game far larger than she could possibly comprehend. Chapter 3, Unveiling the Past, continued. The days aboard the ship began to blend together for Lyra as she adjusted to the quiet rhythm of her recovery. The constant hum of the engines, the flickering of the lights overhead, and the soft thrum of the medbay's automated systems became the soundtrack to her existence as she spent each day gaining a little more strength. Every moment she felt the warmth of the ship's life support systems filling the sterile cabin. She couldn't help but contrast it with the desolate planet she had been abandoned on Zaltari, a broken husk of a world. The memories of the wreckage, the screams of those who had died fighting the final battle, and the slow, agonizing realization that she was alone, left to die, replayed in her mind like an endless loop. The guilt was a heavy weight, even now. Why had she been spared? Why had she been saved? She was just one of many casualties in a war that had wiped out her people. But Ethan's kindness, his determination to bring her back from the brink, was a quiet reminder that not all hope was lost. It had been hard at first, her body too weak to do much other than lay in the sterile bed. But with Ethan's care, with the ship's slow but sure healing process, her body had begun to recover, though her mind still felt fragmented, as if she were still on the battlefield, struggling to hold on. There were moments, though, where her eyes would meet Ethan's across the room, and she saw something that made her feel like she wasn't as alone as she thought. Despite the war that had torn everything apart, despite the shattered world she had once called home, there was still someone here who saw her as more than just a casualty. There was still someone who would stand by her, even if they had just met. As the days passed, Lyra began to trust him more, if only in small, hesitant steps. She could see the weariness in his face, the haunted look in his eyes that suggested he had seen far too much destruction. His life had been shaped by battle and war, just like hers, but there was a quiet sorrow about him, a sadness that spoke of a history too painful to speak of. And so, like her, he buried it. But in the silence of the med bay, when the ship was quiet and the stars outside shone softly in the distance, Lyra often wondered what had brought him to this point. Why was he helping her? Why had he taken the risk to save someone who wasn't even part of his world, who had no ties to him? The question gnawed at her, but she was too afraid to ask. Still, Ethan was a constant presence, checking on her every day, adjusting the medical settings to speed up her recovery, and making sure she ate and rested. He was patient, understanding her silence without pressing her to explain herself. There were times when she caught him staring at her when he thought she wasn't looking, and she knew he was thinking about something far more complex than simply caring for a wounded soldier. One day, as Lyra lay in the medbay recovering, the familiar hiss of the ship's door opening signaled Ethan's entrance. He moved with practiced ease, his boots clicking against the metallic floor as he approached. He placed a tray of food beside her, but this time, there was something different in his eyes. She could see it, the look of someone who had made a decision. "Lyra," he began, his voice softer than usual. "I've been thinking about this for a while now, and I think it's time we talk." Her stomach twisted with nervous anticipation, but she met his gaze, silently urging him to continue. She wasn't sure if she was ready for this conversation, but she knew it was inevitable. She had felt the question lingering between them ever since she had woken up to find him by her side, offering her his help. He wasn't the kind of person who would leave things unspoken, and the tension in the air was almost unbearable. "I'm not asking you to share anything you don't want to," he said, taking a step closer. "But I think it's important that you know who I am and why I'm here. You've been through a lot, and I think you deserve to know what brought me to this point. To this ship." Lyra shifted in the bed, her muscles sore but more responsive with each passing day. She nodded slowly, the weight of his words sinking in. Ethan had a story, and she felt the depth of it already without him saying anything. She could sense it in the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he treated her like someone worthy of his time. "I've been a soldier my whole life," Ethan said, his eyes darkening. "I've fought in wars, fought for causes I didn't believe in. But after everything, the blood, the carnage, the destruction, I couldn't keep fighting for something that didn't feel right anymore. There were too many lives lost, too many people forgotten, and I couldn't do it anymore." He paused for a moment, running his hand over his face as though to push away the memories. "That's when I started doing this, finding the forgotten people, the ones who don't have anyone left. It's not about saving the galaxy. It's about saving the individuals, the ones who deserve a chance to live." Lyra listened intently, her heart beating faster as the truth of his words settled in. She had never imagined that someone like him, a soldier hardened by battle, would find solace in helping the broken, the lost. But there was something in his voice now, something raw and vulnerable, that made her believe every word. He wasn't just here out of duty, he was here because he had seen too much, had been through too much, and had found a way to turn that pain into something meaningful. "I don't know what you've been through," Lyra whispered, her voice hoarse. "But I do know what it feels like to be abandoned, to be left to die. That's all I've ever known." Ethan's expression softened as he stepped closer, carefully sitting on the edge of her bed. "You're not alone anymore," he said, his voice a soft promise. "You don't have to carry that burden by yourself." The words lingered in the air between them, heavy and full of meaning. For a long moment, Lyra didn't speak. She simply stared at him, her violet eyes searching his face as though she were trying to decode something hidden in his expression. She had been left to fend for herself for so long, left with nothing but the weight of her people's legacy, the burden of their loss, and the loneliness that came with being a stranger in a galaxy full of war and strife. But in Ethan's presence, she felt something different, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. She felt the stirrings of hope, of something more. She wasn't just a casualty of war. She was something more. And maybe, just maybe, she could rebuild her life. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice steady now. "Thank you for saving me." Ethan nodded, his expression still unreadable, but his eyes, those dark, intense eyes, showed a quiet understanding. "It's not just me who saved you. We both have our parts to play in this, Lyra. And right now, we're in this together." Chapter 4. A New Beginning. Days turned into weeks as Lyra's recovery progressed. Ethan's care, his dedication to her survival, gave her something she hadn't known in years: hope. The days were still long, the nights still lonely, but with each passing day, Lyra felt herself growing stronger. The ship was quiet, the stars outside the window her only companions, but the steady hum of the engines, the occasional beep of the ship's automated systems, and Ethan's quiet presence were enough to give her a sense of normalcy, something she hadn't felt in so long. As the days passed, Lyra found herself opening up more, not just to Ethan, but to herself. She began to remember things, memories of her world, of her family, of the life she had once had before it had been taken from her. She remembered her home, the lush fields of her people's homeland, the laughter of her sisters as they played beneath the twin moons. But those memories were fading, slipping into the past like dust in the wind. Still, they were a part of her, a part she could carry forward. Ethan, too, began to show more of himself. He shared stories of his past, of the battles he had fought, of the lives he had seen lost. He was a man haunted by the things he had done, the things he had seen, but through it all, he had found a new purpose in helping others. His journey, like hers, had taken him to places he never expected, but it was clear that they had both found something in each other, something neither of them had anticipated. The Serenity moved through the stars, carrying them toward unknown destinations, toward the future that was still unwritten. For the first time, Lyra didn't feel like a casualty of war. She felt like a person, a survivor, someone worthy of a second chance. And with Ethan by her side, she knew that she wasn't alone. They had both been broken by the galaxy, but together, they were learning how to rebuild. As they left behind the ruins of Zaltari, leaving the past and its pain behind, they headed into the unknown, ready to forge a new future. The galaxy had taken much from them, but it hadn't taken everything. And together, they would reclaim what they had lost. The days aboard the Serenity passed with the gentle hum of the ship's engines as Lyra and Ethan continued their quiet existence in the vastness of space. Their journey was one of survival, yes, but also one of rebuilding not just a ship, but themselves. For Lyra, the notion of a second chance was both liberating and terrifying. She had once been a soldier, a warrior who fought with purpose, driven by the survival of her people. But now, with the remnants of her past scattered across the stars and the face of war far behind her, she was learning to live again. And for Ethan, each day spent in the company of someone who understood the weight of survival, the burden of memory, was slowly healing the scars that had been etched into his soul over years of battle and loss. They worked side by side on the ship, Ethan fixing systems that had begun to deteriorate, upgrading the medical bay with new equipment he had scavenged from nearby trade stations. Lyra, though still recovering, would often help with the repairs, her hands steady as she tinkered with the ship's navigation console or checked the sensor readings. They had become a team in every sense of the word, working together not just to ensure their survival, but to prepare for whatever lay ahead. The galaxy was still a dangerous place, full of factions vying for power, but they were no longer simply drifting. They were heading towards something, a goal, even if they weren't entirely sure what it was yet. As weeks turned into months, the isolation of space began to wear off. Lyra started to venture beyond the confines of the medbay, her legs still weak, but steadily regaining strength. She found solace in the quiet of the cockpit, watching the stars slip by, her thoughts drifting as she took in the vast emptiness of space. She would sit for hours, looking out at the stars, wondering if her people were out there somewhere, if any of them had survived, if any of them were still fighting. The thought weighed heavily on her, but Ethan's presence always grounded her, reminding her that, no matter how much she had lost, there was still something worth fighting for. One evening, as the ship drifted through the shadow of a distant planet, Lyra found herself in the cockpit again, her fingers lightly grazing the console. The stars outside glittered with a kind of sadness, like a universe too vast to ever understand. But just as she began to retreat into her thoughts, Ethan walked in, a soft smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I think it's time we figured out where we're going next," he said, his voice low but filled with purpose. "We've been flying around aimlessly for long enough. I know you're starting to feel stronger, and I think it's time we stop hiding. The galaxy's still a dangerous place, but I believe there's more we can do now." Lyra looked up at him, her violet eyes searching his face. "More? But what can we do? You've already saved me. What else is there?" Ethan's smile softened, and he stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "We can fight for what's left of the galaxy," he said, a hint of fire in his eyes. "We can bring people together. The galaxy's been torn apart by war, but I believe it's not beyond saving. There are others out there, rebels, survivors, people who still believe in something worth fighting for. I don't have all the answers, but I think we can start something." Lyra's heart raced at his words. She had never thought of herself as a leader, as someone who could bring about change. She had been a soldier, trained to fight and survive, not to rebuild. But something about Ethan's conviction stirred something deep within her. She hadn't survived just to fade into obscurity. She had survived because there was still something in her worth saving. "Where do we start?" she asked, her voice steady despite the uncertainty that lingered in her chest. Ethan glanced at the stars outside the cockpit, his expression filled with determination. "We start by finding the lost. There are others like you, Lyra. Others who've been abandoned, left to suffer in the wake of this galaxy's wars. We'll start by reaching out, seeing who we can find. We'll build a resistance, a force strong enough to change things. And maybe, just maybe, we can start to heal the galaxy together." Lyra took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision settle in her chest. But it wasn't a burden she wanted to run from. It was a purpose, a future. "Let's do it," she said, her voice firm. "Let's make it happen." And so, the Serenity set a course for the unknown, leaving behind the darkness of their past, and heading toward a new future, a future where hope was no longer a distant dream, but a tangible reality. Together, Lyra and Ethan would forge a new path, one where they would fight for the lives of those who had been forgotten, fight for the people who needed them most, and fight for a galaxy that had long since lost its way.